I found my son going through my safe at 2 in the morning. He didn't hear me on the stairs. He was elbow deep in the lockbox I kept behind the painting of the Texas Hill Country, the one my wife picked out at a garage sale before the cancer took her. I stood in the dark hallway watching him, and I would have thought it was a dream except for the sound, the soft, methodical rustle of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. Then my daughter-in-law appeared in the doorway behind him, and she wasn't surprised to see the safe open. She handed him a small flashlight, and that's when I understood that nothing in my life was what I thought it was. If you've ever had the ground fall out from under you in the middle of your own home, hit that like button and stay with me, because what I found out in the next 3 weeks was so much worse than a son going through his father's papers. My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 67 years old. I spent 42 years building an electrical contracting business in the Dallas-Fort Worth area out of nothing but a used truck, a set of tools I bought on credit, and a stubbornness my late wife used to call my greatest flaw and my greatest gift. When Margaret died 3 years ago, I kept working because work was the only thing that kept the silence from swallowing me whole. The business had grown to 30 employees. We wired hospitals and schools and office parks. My name was on the side of 4 company trucks. I had done everything right. I thought my son would be proud of that legacy. I thought wrong. Let me back up to how it started. Because looking back now, all the signs were there. I just chose not to see them. About 8 months before that night, my son started coming around more. He'd always been distant, not cruel, just absorbed in his own life. But suddenly, he was stopping by the office twice a week, asking questions about accounts receivable, about the equipment loans, about the value of the commercial contracts. I thought he was finally taking an interest. I thought he wanted to learn the business, the way I'd always hoped. His wife started coming to Sunday dinners again, which she hadn't done since Margaret's funeral. She brought casseroles and called me Dad, and asked about my blood pressure medication with an attentiveness that made me feel cared for. I was a 67-year-old widower who ate too much takeout and worked too many hours. I was hungry for that. I let myself believe it was real. My son had been working as a sales manager for a construction supply company for 15 years. Steady job, decent salary, not ambitious. His wife had her own small bookkeeping practice. They had a nice house, a reasonable life, no children. When he started asking about the business, I assumed he'd finally grown into the ambition I always wished he had. I offered to start training him on operations. He said he'd think about it. That should have been the first flag. The night I found him at my safe, I had come downstairs for water. I have a bad knee from a fall off a ladder in 1998, and the stairs announce my presence whether I want them to or not. But I moved slowly that night, and the television in the living room had been left on, and the sound covered my steps. I saw the light under the study door. I thought I'd left my desk lamp on. I pushed the door open to find my son crouched in front of the open safe, and his wife standing guard at the door, and the two of them looking at me with the exact same expression, not guilt, not embarrassment, but the cold recalculation of people whose plan has been interrupted. He stood up. He had a folder in his hands. My insurance documents. My property deeds. He held them like they were already his. I didn't say anything. I stood in the doorway and looked at my boy, my 41-year-old son with his mother's eyes and his own particular brand of cowardice, and I waited to see what story he would reach for. He said he was worried about me. He said he'd noticed I was forgetting things, misplacing items, getting confused in conversations. He said he and his wife had been discussing whether I was still capable of running the business safely, whether it was time to consider some kind of transition. He said they were just trying to protect me. He said it with the practiced steadiness of someone who had rehearsed it. I told him to put the documents back. I told them both good night, and I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. I did not sleep. I sat there, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I had just seen. And then, I packed the feeling away somewhere deep and cold. The way you pack away grief when you have work to do. Because I had spent 42 years in a trade where you don't react to a live wire, you isolate it first. You trace it back to the source. You find out how far the circuit runs before you cut the power. I called my daughter the next morning. She lives in Phoenix now, works as a hospital administrator. She and her brother have never been close, which I always blamed on the difference in their personalities. She is sharp where he is soft, direct where he hedges. She answers the phone on the second ring. Always, no matter the hour. When I told her what I saw, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, I've been waiting for you to call me about this for 2 months." She told me she had noticed things when she visited at Christmas. The way her brother and his wife spoke about the business, the questions they asked about its worth. She had seen her brother take photographs of the equipment in the yard when he thought no one was watching. She had heard his wife on the phone in the guest bathroom, lowering her voice. She had hired a private investigator 6 weeks ago and had not told me because she was afraid I wouldn't believe her. She asked me if I was ready to hear what the investigator had found. I told her yes. Her brother had met with 2 attorneys in the past 3 months. Not estate attorneys. Elder law attorneys who specialize in guardianship and conservatorship proceedings. He had submitted a written statement to one of them, describing what he characterized as a pattern of cognitive decline in his father, that would be me, including memory loss, financial irresponsibility, and an inability to manage complex decisions. He had been building a paper trail to have me declared legally incompetent. If he succeeded, he would be appointed my conservator. A conservator controls your finances, your property, your medical decisions. Everything I owned, everything I had built, would pass through his hands while I was still breathing. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to my daughter read me the investigator's findings. And I want you to understand what that feeling is like. Not anger. Not at first. Something quieter than anger. The specific grief of recognizing that the person you raised, the child you coached through Little League and helped move into his first apartment and stood beside at his wedding, has been sitting across from you at dinner and looking at you with manufactured concern and practicing the words he'll use to take your life apart. That feeling doesn't have a good name. It sits in your chest like a stone. Then the anger came. I let it come for exactly 1 minute, and then I put it somewhere useful. I told my daughter I needed a few days before she came to Dallas. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. She said she understood, but told me not to confront him yet. She used a word I didn't expect from her. She said, "Dad, we can make this hurt a lot more than just stopping him. Do you want to stop him? Or do you want to make sure he can't do this to anyone else?" I asked her what she meant. She said, "Give me a week." During that week, I did 2 things. First, I called my own attorney, a woman I'd used for business contracts for 20 years, and told her to start reviewing my estate documents and the business structure. Second, I kept showing up to Sunday dinners. I kept answering my son's calls. I let him and his wife bring me meals and ask about my appointments and make small noises of concern about how tired I looked. I let them play their parts. I noticed how carefully they watched me. Every time I misremembered a name or reached for a word slowly, I saw them exchange the smallest look, a confirmation, a notation, like researchers marking data points. They were building their case in real time, and they were glad when I gave them material to work with. I started giving them more. I left the stove on once on purpose. I paid a bill twice and mentioned it at dinner. I called my son by the wrong name on a voicemail and let it stand. I watched his face at our next dinner. He was trying not to look pleased. My daughter arrived on a Thursday. She didn't come to the house. We met at a diner on the far side of the county, the kind of place where nobody knows you, where the coffee is bad and the booths are high-backed and private. She brought her laptop and the investigator's full file, which was thicker than I expected. She also brought a woman I didn't know, a forensic accountant named Patricia, who had worked financial fraud cases for 15 years, and who looked at me across the table with the particular directness of someone who has sat across from a lot of people in difficult situations and has no patience for anything but the truth. My daughter opened the file. What I learned in that diner over the next 2 hours changed everything. The conservatorship plan was real and further along than I had imagined. My son had already engaged a doctor, a psychiatrist I had never heard of, who had agreed to conduct an evaluation and whose practice had a history of providing documentation in guardianship cases for a fee. Patricia showed me the financial trail. My son had borrowed heavily against his house 18 months ago. His wife's bookkeeping practice had lost its two largest clients. They were underwater. Not catastrophically, but enough to make 67-year-old widower with a 40-year-old business and no other heirs look like a solution. But there was more. Patricia slid a bank statement across the table. There was a joint account I had never seen before, opened 14 months ago, with my son's name on it, and a second name I recognized, one of my longest-running foremen, a man I had hired 20 years ago. Trained from nothing, trusted with the keys to every job site. He had been submitting false invoices for materials equipment we billed to clients but never purchased, and diverting the overpayments into that account. My son had been in on it from the beginning. The amount over 14 months was close to $90,000. My daughter watched my face while I read. She didn't try to comfort me. She knew me well enough to know that what I needed in that moment was not comfort. She let me sit with it, and then she said, "Dad, they took from the business you built for 40 years. They took from your employees' livelihoods. They took from Mom's legacy. And they were going to take everything else the moment a judge signed a piece of paper. Tell me what you want to do." I looked at my daughter. She had her mother's jaw, the set of it when she'd made up her mind. I asked her what she had in mind. She turned to Patricia, who opened a second folder. The plan was this. There was enough evidence to go to law enforcement immediately, but the conservatorship fraud and the invoice theft were separate cases that would likely be handled by separate agencies and could take years to resolve. What my daughter proposed was more immediate and considerably more permanent. She had found out through the investigator that my son was planning to file the conservatorship petition in 6 weeks, triggered by what he believed would be a full evaluation report from his hired psychiatrist. He needed 2 things to proceed: the medical documentation and a co-petitioner, which was going to be his wife. For the petition to succeed, he also needed to demonstrate that I was making financially unsound decisions, which is why, Patricia believed, he had authorized the invoice fraud with my foreman. He needed receipts, showing I had been approving large, irregular payments without proper oversight. He was manufacturing evidence of my incompetence. My daughter's plan required patience. It required me to continue performing decline for another 4 weeks. It required Patricia to prepare a parallel set of documents that would be waiting for my son the moment he thought he'd won. And it required me to make one single phone call to a detective at the County Economic Crimes Unit whom Patricia had worked with before. I told them I could do it. My daughter looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded. She said, "You have to stay angry enough to stay sharp and calm enough not to tip your hand." I told her I had been doing exactly that for 42 years, every time I had to sit across the table from a contractor who was trying to short me on materials. She almost smiled. "Thanks for watching." Also, "Thanks for watching." She almost smiled. "Thanks for watching." She round stonane. The next 4 weeks were the longest of my life. I went to Sunday dinners. I let my son's wife adjust my pill organizer and speak to me in the slightly elevated volume people use with the elderly and the confused. I let my son walk me through the house once, ostensibly helping me find my reading glasses, while he catalogued every room with the quiet inventory of a man planning an estate sale. I noticed him testing doors, noting the security system panel, looking at the filing cabinet in the study. I noticed all of it, and I gave him nothing to worry about. I spilled coffee at dinner once. I forgot the name of a senator I'd mentioned 4 times before. I asked my son twice about a fishing trip we'd never taken, as if I were remembering something real. He was gentle with me during those weeks. That was the hardest part. He was kind, in the way people are kind, to things they are about to put down. Careful, conscientious, trying to make the end comfortable. His wife brought me a new bathrobe and hung it on the hook in the bathroom without being asked. She organized my prescriptions into a weekly tray and left a printed sheet of instructions on the counter as if I couldn't manage a pill bottle. I watched them care for me, and I understood exactly what it was. It wasn't cruelty. In some ways, cruelty would have been easier. It was the tidying up of a life they had already decided was over. I thought about my foreman during those weeks. The man I had hired when he was 23 years old and didn't know a conduit bender from a circuit breaker. I had trained him on my own time. I had given him raises when the business barely supported it. I had attended his mother's funeral and stood with him in the rain at the cemetery. I had trusted him with every job site I had. The thought of his name on that account, next to my son's, was in some ways the most painful discovery of all. I called him on a Friday afternoon, from the parking lot of the hardware store so no one could hear. I told him what I knew. I told him what was coming. I gave him one chance to cooperate and he took it. Quietly, with a remorse that sounded real. Though I had learned recently that I was not always the best judge of what was real. The conservatorship petition was filed on a Tuesday. I know because my attorney called me the moment it hit the court system. My son had not told me. He had planned, I imagine, for me to find out through a formal process server, surrounded by the official machinery of the law, too confused and overwhelmed to fight back effectively. My attorney filed our response that same afternoon. Patricia walked the financial fraud documentation over to the detective's office in person. I called my son that evening. I told him I'd like him to come to dinner on Sunday. He said, of course. He sounded warm and steady, and I thought about what it costs a person to maintain that kind of composure when they believe they are days away from controlling their father's entire estate. He was good. I had raised a boy who turned into a man who was genuinely skilled at deception. I had no idea where that had come from. And sitting with that question had kept me awake more than the betrayal itself. Sunday came. My daughter drove in from Phoenix that morning and went straight to my attorney's office. She would come to the house later. My son and his wife arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine and a pot of something his wife had made, which she set on the stove with the familiar proprietary ease of a woman who has decided the kitchen is already hers. They set the table. They poured the wine. My son asked about my week with the gentle probing attention of someone monitoring a patient. I told him the week had been fine. I told him I'd been doing some paperwork, which was true. We ate. The food was good. The conversation was careful on their side. I could feel them managing it, steering away from anything that might agitate me, keeping the tone warm and uncomplicated. After dinner, my son helped me clear the plates, and his wife wiped down the counter, and then we sat back down at the table with our wine, and my son folded his hands and looked at me with the expression he had clearly prepared for this moment. He told me he had some difficult news. He told me it came from a place of love. He told me he and his wife had been worried about me for a long time, and that they had taken some steps to make sure I was protected. He used that word, protected. He told me that the courts had a process for situations like mine, for aging parents who needed support managing their affairs, and that he had engaged that process because he loved me and wanted to make sure I was taken care of. He looked at his wife, and she nodded with the expression of a woman performing compassion for an audience. He told me not to worry, that nothing would change in my day-to-day life, that I would still be in my home and still be comfortable. He just needed me to understand that the business and the financial decisions would be handled by him going forward. I let him finish. I picked up my wine glass, and I took a sip, and I set it back down on the table with a care and deliberateness that I had been practicing for weeks. Then, I looked at my son, and I stopped pretending. I said, I've been doing this wrong all week. I've been sitting here slumping my shoulders and speaking slowly and letting you talk to me like I'm already gone. And I've been doing it for 4 weeks, actually. Maybe longer than that, since the night I found you at my safe and decided not to say a word. He blinked. His wife's hand went still on the stem of her glass. I sat up straight. I am 6 feet tall, and I spent 4 decades on job sites, and I have the posture of a man who has never been intimidated in a commercial negotiation in his life. I let that come back into my body. I looked at my son the way I used to look at subcontractors, who thought they could pad a quote because I wouldn't notice. I told him I knew about the conservatorship petition. I told him I knew about the psychiatrist. I told him about the invoice fraud. I said the number slowly. $90,000, and watched his face go through 3 different expressions before it landed on something blank and scared. I told him I knew about the joint account. I told him his foreman had already given a statement to the County Economic Crimes Unit. I told him Patricia's name and I watched his wife's mouth open slightly because they knew Patricia's name. They had done enough research to know her name, and the moment she heard it, she understood the shape of what had been assembled against them. The front door opened. My daughter walked in. She was wearing a gray blazer, and she had her laptop bag over her shoulder, and she looked like what she was, a hospital administrator who has managed crises for 15 years and does not raise her voice. She set her bag on the counter. She said hello to her brother. He didn't say anything back. I told them what was going to happen. The fraud charges were already in motion. The conservatorship petition would be answered with a full financial audit of every communication my son had with his attorney, every document filed, every statement made about my mental capacity, and the forensic record would show a man manufacturing evidence against his own father. Not a son trying to protect him. I told them my attorney was filing a civil suit for the $90,000 plus interest plus damages. I told them I had changed the locks on the business, the equipment yard, and my home, and that effective Monday morning my son's name had been removed from every account and every emergency contact list in my file. My son started to speak. I let him get 3 words out, and then I said, "I need you to stop talking." Not because I'm too frail to hear it, because I spent 42 years building something real, and the last thing I am going to do is sit at my own kitchen table and listen to you explain yourself. His wife started crying. I looked at her, and I felt nothing. I had used up every feeling I had for her during those 4 weeks of watching her. Wipe down my counters and sort my pills with the careful attention of a woman, making sure her investment was maintained. I told her she was welcome to take the casserole dish. I told them both to go. They went. My son walked out without looking at me. His wife took the casserole dish. The door closed behind them, and the house was very quiet. My daughter stood by the window watching their car back out of the driveway. She didn't say anything until the headlights were gone. Then she turned around, and she looked at me, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Dallas, her face did something other than professional composure. Her chin went. Just briefly. She crossed the room and she put her arms around me, and I held my daughter in my own kitchen in the house where I had raised her. And we stood there for a while without saying anything at all. She cried a little. I didn't. Not right then, that came later. In the way grief comes when you are alone, and the house is quiet, and you understand that the child you raised has chosen something that can't be undone. But in that moment I just held her, and I was grateful. Grateful for a daughter who had paid attention when I didn't. Grateful for the stubbornness she got from her mother and redirected toward saving me. Grateful that I was standing in my own home with the deed to my own name and the work of my own hands still intact around me. We sat on the back porch for a long time after. The sky over the neighborhood was the particular dark blue of a Texas evening in early spring. I had a beer. She had the rest of the wine. She asked me how I felt. I told her I felt like a man who had been carrying a slow poison for 8 months without knowing it and had finally identified the source. She said that was exactly what it was. I told her I was sorrier than I could say that she had carried the knowledge of this alone for 6 weeks before I found out. She told me she had been waiting for me to be ready to hear it. She said she knew the difference between protecting someone and treating them like they need protecting. And she had been trying to get the balance right. I told her she had gotten it exactly right. She said she had her father's instincts. I told her she had her mother's. The business went through 2 difficult months. Losing a foreman with 20 years of institutional knowledge is not a small thing, regardless of how he came to leave. But I had 30 employees who showed up every morning and did good work and had families depending on those paychecks. And you don't abandon people because of what someone else did. We hired 2 younger electricians, and I promoted the job site supervisor I should have elevated years ago, a woman who had been quietly running circles around everyone else on the crew and who, when I offered her the foreman title, looked at me and said, "It took you long enough." She was right. The fraud case settled. My son's attorney negotiated a repayment arrangement that will follow him for a decade. The conservatorship petition was dismissed. The psychiatrist's license is under review by the state medical board. I'm told these things take time. I have time. My son and I have not spoken since that Sunday evening. I don't know what the right distance is yet. Some mornings I wake up with something that is almost grief and almost anger, and mostly just the particular loneliness of a man who understands he was wrong about something important for a very long time. I don't think my son was always the person he became. I think hardship and proximity to something easy will make people do things that their younger selves wouldn't recognize. I think about the boy he was before he became someone who could sit across a dinner table from his father and smile. I think about that more than I expected to. What I don't do is second-guess myself. I didn't make the first move. I gave him every opportunity to be something better, and he used those opportunities to refine the plan. At a certain point, you have to stop treating the decision as yours and accept that someone else made it. My late wife used to say that you can love someone and still make them live with the consequences of what they chose. She was wiser than me about most things. She still is. To anyone watching this who recognizes something in what I've described, a family member who has become suddenly attentive in a way that feels more like assessment than affection, conversations that circle too often around what you own and what happens to it, questions about your health that carry something underneath them that doesn't feel like concern. I want to say this. The instinct you have is not paranoia. The discomfort you feel is information. Act on it before the papers get filed and the story gets written for you. Talk to your own attorney. Talk to the child or the friend or the old colleague who has never asked you for anything. The people who genuinely love you are not quiet about it, but they are not calculating about it either. I am 67 years old. My knee aches when it rains. I eat dinner alone 4 nights a week, and I talk to my late wife's photograph more than I will admit to anyone. But the name on the side of those 4 trucks is still my name. The 30 people who show up to that yard every morning are still my responsibility and my pride. The house is still mine. Nobody took it. Nobody put me away. And my daughter calls me every Sunday at 7 in the evening, like clockwork, and asks about my week and argues with me about football and laughs at things that are not that funny. And I sit on my back porch in the Texas dark, and I am grateful for every word of it. If you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more. And take care of the people who actually show up. You'll know who they are.